Notes 1.6 are about simplifying radicals. And if you read what it says on the top of your page, it says in order to do any operations on radicals, you must know the first 15 perfect squares by heart. You don't technically need just the first 15. If you know more than that, even better. The more you know, the better off you're going to be. So let's go ahead and start filling in some of these numbers. 1 squared is 1 because it's 1 times 1. A common mistake is a lot of people will think it's 2 because they'll double 1. Be careful. 2 squared is 4. Go through and fill in all the ones you know without a calculator. The ones you don't know, leave blank, please. Pause the video, please, and fill in the ones you know. And then when you are ready to move on, come back to me. All right, so these are the answers that you have. Any questions that you had to leave blank, please circle those so you know that those are some perfect squares that you are going to need to study and to memorize. And now go ahead and fill in the numbers that you weren't sure about if there are any blanks that you have on your paper, okay? All right, so we're going to be talking about simplifying radicals. So question number 1 says factor the number, the example that we have is the square root of 80. And here are several steps that you need in order to simplify radicals. So if you forget how to simplify radicals, you're just going to turn to this page of your notes and look it up. So question number 1 says to factor the number under the radical sign if possible so that one of its factors is the largest possible perfect square. So the number under the radical sign is 80, okay? And so I'm going to factor the number 80. Now the first perfect square is 1, so I know that 1 is a factor because 1 is a factor of any real number. Now 2 is also a factor of 80, but I'm not going to include 2 in my answer because 2 is not a perfect square. So I'm only going to include 4 because 4 is a perfect square. Now 4 is a multiple of 80 and I end up getting 20. So my answer here in my chart, not my answer, the number I'm going to put in my chart are 4 and 20, okay? Now the next perfect square is 9. And again, for example, 5 is a factor of 80, but I'm not going to put it in my chart quite yet because it's not a perfect square, okay? So the next perfect square is 9, but I'm not going to include it because 9 is not a factor of 80. So the next perfect square after 9, which is 3 squared, is 16 because that's 4 squared. And 16 is a factor of 80 because 80 divided by 16 is 5, okay? And I'm going to keep going with my perfect squares until I get to the halfway point. The halfway point of 80 is 40. So 4 squared works, which is 16. 5 squared is 25. 25 is not a factor of 80. 6 squared is 36, which is not a factor of 80. And then the next perfect square is 7 squared, which is 49, which is more than the halfway point, so I don't have to include it. So my largest possible perfect square is 16. So I'm going to use 16 and 5 as my factors. Now, step 2 says you're allowed to split up a radical sign if there's multiplication underneath it. So if the problem says radical 80, I'm allowed to say that this is just basically radical 16 times radical 5, okay? And then lastly, step number 3 says to evaluate the square root of the perfect square and leave the other factor underneath the radical sign. So 16 is a perfect square. I end up getting 4. Now, since I've done the square rooting, I don't put the square root on the 4, even though 4 is a perfect square. I've done my square rooting, I've done the actual operation, so I don't need to include it anymore. So then I have 4 times the square root of 5 because 5 is not a perfect square. So 4 radical 5 is my answer, okay? Now, I just want to show you guys something, just so that you can kind of understand. Let's say on accident you decide to use 4 and 20. Because 4 and 20 are possible factors, but it's not the largest possible perfect square. So let's say I use radical 4 and radical 20. Well, radical 4 is just 2. And remember, when you square root, you don't need the square root sign anymore. So it would be 2 radical 20. Now, notice in my final answer that I got here, I got radical 5. 5 is not divisible by any perfect squares other than 1. So I know this is my final answer. 20, however, is divisible by a perfect square. And that perfect square is 4. So I'm going to split up the radical 20 as radical 4 times radical 5, but the 2 gets copied down. The 2 still gets copied down. The square root of 4 is 2, and then I have radical 5. Now I just multiply these guys together, so I get 4 radical 5, and then I'm done. So I could do it either way. I would still get the same answer, but you have to be really careful about how you do it. If you do it this way, the way that's on the right side right here, then you have to remember to simplify all the way. If you do it this way, it's much less work, but you have to remember to find the largest perfect square from the beginning. Okay, so let's try a couple examples. If you look at number 1, it says the square root of 200. Now, the first thing that you have to remember is that you have to ask yourself, is 200 a perfect square? Because we're only going to simplify radicals if they're not square rootable. If they're square rootable, you just square root them. So 200, for example, is not square rootable. It's irrational, so we're going to simplify it. So the way we do it again is just like we did for radical 80. I'm going to look at possible numbers I can divide 200 by that are perfect squares. So 1 works. All right. The next perfect square is 2 squared, which is 4. 200 is divisible by 4. And when you divide it by 4, you'll end up getting 50. Okay. 3 squared is 9. 200 is not divisible by 9. 4 squared is 16. 200 is not divisible by 16. So then 5 squared is 25. 200 is divisible by 25. You end up getting 8. Okay, and then 6 squared is 36. It doesn't work. 49 doesn't work. 64 doesn't work. 81 doesn't work. But 100 does work, and that's the halfway point. So this is the largest possible perfect square. So I'm just going to say that radical 200 is radical 100 times radical 2. So I end up getting 10 radical 2 is my final answer. The reason why I got this 10 is because the square root of 100 is 10, and then square root of 2 I can't square root, so I leave it there. All right, question number 2. We're going to ignore the 5 for right now, and let's look at the 27. 27 is not square rootable, so I'm not going to be able to just figure out what it is, which means I have to simplify it. So what I want you to do is just make your chart for 27, see how you do. Press pause and then come back to me when you're ready to go. So you should get that the only factors are 1 and 27 and 9 and 3. So you should use the 9 and the 3. So the square root of 27 is going to split up into square root of 9, or radical 9 times radical 3. Now the question is, what do you do with the 5? You can't do anything with it, so you just copy it down. Okay? Now, again, you can't do anything with the 5 on the next line, so I'm going to copy it down. I can't square root the 9 here, and I end up getting 3. And then this radical 3 is just going to tag along, which means that my answer is going to be 5 times 3, which is 15, so my final answer would be 15 radical 3. Okay? All right, and number 3, I want to look at perfect squares that I can divide 17 by. Now 17 is prime, so I can't divide it by anything other than 1. Dividing it by 1 really doesn't do anything for me, so my final answer is just radical 17. I can't do anything else with it. Okay? All right, number 4. I want you to try number 4 on your own. Please press pause and then come back to me when you are all set to go. Okay, in number 4, you should make a chart for 52. So I'm going to make a chart for 52, and hopefully you got that the only factors that are perfect squares that 52 is divisible by are 1 and 52 and 4 and 13. So again, I'm just going to copy the 6 down, okay? And then I'm going to split up the square root of 52 as the square root of 4 times the square root of 13, okay? I can't do anything with the 6 again, so I'm going to copy it down. I know the square root of 4 is 2. Remember, no square root sign is necessary because you've done the square rooting. And then I'm going to copy the radical 13 now. Now I can just multiply the 6 times the 2, and I end up getting 12 radical 13, and that's my final answer. Okay? And now let's look at number 5. Number 5 says the square root of 81. It should take you 10 seconds to figure this out, if that, because it is a perfect square. So you don't have to do anything at all to figure this out. The answer is just plain and simply 9. And then you are done. All right, hopefully that makes sense. I will see you in class soon.